Stories that matter. The journey of life from birth to death is an extraordinary trip, sometimes filled with great joy and excitement, but at other times filled with pain, sorrow, and disappointment. Stories That Matter shares both extremes with you. Sometimes our stories will make you feel very happy, but the journey of life is not all happiness. Other times, the journey of life will make you feel sad, for all of us have experienced both extremes. Stories That Matter will begin right after the break with a story that will touch your heart in the journey of life.
Welcome to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Wyatt Thompson. This is a special one for us. Wyatt and I are not related, even though our last names are the same. But Wyatt's from our home area, and this is a show I've been looking forward to doing for quite a while. Had to wait for the right time frame when Wyatt wouldn't be off on Big 12 basketball, football games, or anything else. You're a busy guy.
Well, great to be with you, by the way. Great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you, and thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come over to the Kansas Auto Racing Museum, be in our studio, and to do a Stories That Matter with us.
Well, we're excited to be here. I can't tell you how cool it has been to see this again. It's been a long time. And I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about my career.
I'm looking forward to it. Now, of course, the people who are watching this will know you and your voice by the voice of the Wildcats. Now, many times when you're doing radio, of course, they hear that.
Sure.
And then when they get to see you, they say, well, you know, that sounds like the guy.
Yeah.
He looks just like the guy that I hear on the radio a lot. But, of course, I know you've done a lot of television because you do coaches shows, too.
Right.
And so I'm sure that your face is well known to these folks, but the story they don't know is how you got into broadcasting, and then how you became the voice of the Wildcats.
Well, it's a long story, but we'll shorten it up here a little
Okay.
bit. I originally, and I know you knew my father and know my mother, I originally thought that I was going to be like my father and be kind of in the ag industry. I accepted a scholarship as a livestock judge of all things many, many years ago, back in the middle 70s, and was going to study animal science at Colby Community College. And as fate had it, my roommate was studying broadcast journalism, and during my off time with that, I kind of followed him around and went to the college radio station and all of that. Went home at semester, told my parents I wanted to give up the scholarship, wanted to borrow money, and wanted to get into broadcast journalism and try to do some play-by-play. And so that's the original start to it. I was so fortunate, Doug, early to my first job in the business. I worked for a gentleman in Goodland, Kansas by the name of Kay Amelia. I didn't know this at the time, but I would tell you now, all these years later, 40 plus years later, that I think he's probably one of the best 10 or 15 broadcasters in the history of the state. And I was there 2.5, almost 3 years, and it was probably some of the best training ground that I got. And after that, I bounced around a little bit, actually even came back and worked in Abilene for a while, which I thoroughly enjoyed, because it's always that and Solomon have always kind of been home.
Sure.
Ended up in places like Ark City and Great Bend, where my son was born. And the real big first break for me was going to KAYS and Hayes and working for Bob Schmidt and those fine people out there. This would have been a little less than a decade later. I was there from 84 to 89, and then to Fort Collins, worked at Colorado State in Fort Collins, Colorado for 13 years basically, and then had the opportunity to get to Kansas State. And the tie for me to Kansas State wasn't the fact that I grew up here and grew up a Wildcat fan. It was more that their athletic director at the time, Tim Weiser, was at Colorado State for about 3 years of my stay there. And when they had an opening in Manhattan, he called and asked if I would be interested, and I said, boy, would I. and now I've been at Kansas State 15, starting 16 years, and it's been a great run.
Oh, I can imagine that it has been. And
Yeah.
you think about Kansas State, I imagine when you first got that call, that was probably a dream job for you.
Oh, without a doubt. But, you know, at the time when I went to Fort Collins, Mitch Holtis was the voice, and he was so good, and everybody knows Mitch, and he's now the legendary voice of the Chiefs, if you will, and does such a great job. And he was followed by Greg Sharp. So I never really thought about K-State as a destination in any way, shape, or form, because I never thought it'd be available. So when it became available, it really was kind of a no-brainer, to be honest.
Oh, I can imagine. And when you got there, I'm sure as you grew up in this area too, and you think back about it, I can remember playing basketball in the hayloft and shooting baskets by myself up there, and I'd be listening to Deb Nelson.
Well, nobody probably was any better and maybe more unique than Dev. In my career at K-State, I get asked a lot about the former voices, and so many of us that in particular are somewhat in our age group will bring up Dev. And Dev was a one-of-a-kind, kind of like Harry Carey, a one-of-a-kind individual, a one-of-a-kind talent, and I believe one of the best the state's ever produced.
No, I would agree with you. I had the pleasure of being the first president of the Kansas Sports Hall of Fame, so I got to meet Deb several times.
Yeah.
What a wonderful gentleman. Did you ever get to meet him?
Oh yeah, yeah, and I won't sit here and tell you that we were best friends or anything like that, but I did get to be around him on a handful of occasions. I was young enough at the time, Doug, I was just mesmerized by him and his legend, if you will. And, you know, growing up in this area, you know, a Hearn Fieldhouse and Kansas State basketball and Jack Hartman and those kind of things resonated so much in my life, and I'm sure yours too.
Yeah, it did. We've got to cut away, take a break. We'll be right back. You're watching Stories That Matter. Welcome back to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Wyatt Thompson, the voice of the Wildcats. If you missed the first part of the segment, generally what Wyatt and I were talking about is how he got his history in broadcasting that brought him over to Kansas State. Your first year at K-State was 2002, right?
2002.
Okay, and then you had the football team had tremendous success almost right away.
I was so fortunate in those early years. Let me say first and foremost, I thought I knew all about K-State. Thought I knew all about Bill Snyder. Probably really didn't have a clue, to be honest with you. And I was so lucky in those early years in 02 and 03. You think about some of the talent at that time. Terrence Newman, who's still in the NFL 15 plus years later. Darren Sproles, L. Roberson, those kind of guys. That 02 team went to a bowl, won the Holiday Bowl in San Diego, and the 03 team, of course, was one of Coach Snyder's best teams. His first Big 12 championship, and beat a terrific Oklahoma team at Arrowhead in Kansas City, and still to this day, probably my most favorite game broadcast in my 40-plus year career.
Well, Oklahoma didn't like that one so well. They had expectations of something different than that, and K-State just ran right over them.
Well, it was a special night because and they had a legendary broadcaster. We were talking about Dev Nelson in our first segment. They had a legendary broadcaster at OU at the time in their own right, and Bob Berry Sr. And I remember Bob asking me for the pregame show, what does K-State have to do to stay in the game? It wasn't to win. So no one was really expecting Kansas State to win the game, and it was a magical night for so many reasons. First, the heartbreak of '98, I'll go back to that, and that was before my time, but Coach Snyder was here, and that was a great team. We all know that. Probably had the championship won against A&M in St. Louis and didn't win, and the heartbreak of that, I think to a small degree at least, went away that night at Arrowhead. Because K-State they won the game 35-7 and dominated what many thought at the time was one of the best teams in the history of college football. So it was a spectacular night. I think one of the crowning moments of Bill Snyder's brilliant career.
You know, of course, I have met Coach Snyder a couple of times back when I was president of the Hall of Fame. We were on the same speaking location 2 or 3 times, so I would be backstage with him once in a while. He wouldn't remember me after all these years, but I was always listening to him because of his philosophy and that one day at a time, and just make yourself better and make yourself better every day, and the work ethic and those things. And you really can't tell a high from him like winning the Oklahoma game. Sure, he was excited about it, and he was excited for his players, and he's disappointed when he loses. But he keeps his emotions in check pretty well, doesn't he?
You said that perfectly, Doug, because in my career, and I've worked with a lot of coaches, not necessarily at this particular level. I've been at the Division I level since 1989, so it's been a while. But in all of those years, I don't know that I've known a coach that can, what I'll describe as flush a loss, better than Bill Snyder. He doesn't let one loss become 2, and he talks about consistency and, like you said, kind of just doing it one day at a time and getting a little bit better each day. And I think he is just so consistent, maybe the most consistent person I've ever known. And I don't mean just coach, I mean person, in what he does personally and professionally. He's so good in terms of identifying people that fit his program, and then the player development part of it. I think a lot of people around the country have this perception of Coach Snyder that he wins and doesn't really have a lot of talent. I would tell you he wins for a lot of different reasons. Part of that is his brilliant coaching and his offensive mind, but make no mistake about it, he's also very good at identifying and developing players, and we've had a lot of success stories over the years of great players at Kansas State.
And you would have to be able to do that, to be able to meet a high school kid and then be able to size up his character and then his potential. Has he reached his potential and he's now headed the other direction?
Yeah.
Or is he on the rise? And Coach Snyder certainly is able to do that because he brings in kids that seem to fit the system very well. And you don't, for having a lot of kids coming into a program, you doesn't have much problem with off-field behavior from the kids.
Well, I think part of that is identifying the young people that fit and understand that want coaching, that want discipline, that want direction, and there's a lot of help there, whether it's athletically or academically at K-State. We're blessed with a lot of good people there. Coach would be the first to tell you that, and I don't want to speak for him, but I've heard him say it a million times. And when you put all of that together, it kind of is what K-State football is all about. And I think about how many wonderful stories we've had in just the 15, going on 16 years that I've been there. We've mentioned a few names, Terrence Newman, Darren Sproles, those types of guys. But what about the Jordy Nelsons and the John McGraws and the Colin Kleins? I mean, we're limited on time here today in this show, but we could do this for a long time talking about players.
You could go through the roster of every year since you've been there in 2002, and you would be able to say, look at these people, because they'd have that name recognition. I've always enjoyed with Coach Snyder. I have a history degree, so I studied quite a bit of Eisenhower, and I always was impressed how Eisenhower paid absolute attention to every detail, and I know Coach Snyder does. And I balance that against somebody like Patton, because Eisenhower had to try to control Patton, and Patton was full speed ahead, and something will happen, and it did, and it usually happened. But Eisenhower was a lot of planning, and I perceive that Coach Snyder's a lot like that. I bet his coaches around him would say, "We are so detail oriented to everything." Is that the way that it actually is?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate, and I think you described it in such a good way, in that it all starts with the leader, in my mind. And one of the things about being a great leader is hiring good people to work for you and with you, and letting them work and do their job. And I think about, some of the people that Coach Snyder has hired over the years. His first staff, and you know this as well as anyone, Bob Stoops and Mike Stoops and some of the, some of those kind of guys. It's just extraordinary how many of those guys have gone on to terrific careers as coordinators, as head coaches. And it continues to do that.
Yeah.
It just does.
And the work ethic that they got from Coach Snyder is tremendous. Whether or not they implemented that in their next program, some of it they certainly did, because they didn't have any other choice, but because that's what they knew. Yeah, he would be legendary for the number of coaches that have gone on from his programs to have success. We've got to cut away, take a break, Wyatt, but we're going to be right back. Welcome back to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Wyatt Thompson, the voice of the Wildcats. Wyatt, we've been talking about the football program because Kansas State, of course, is known for that, at least under the Snyder administration. And let's go back and talk a little about the basketball, because over the years, Kansas State has always kind of been the second in the state to the KU basketball program. And now the Wichita program is certainly crowding in and getting KU's attention. K-State's not afraid to play them, but KU seems to want to kind of dodge them a little bit like that. So when you came in, who was the head coach in basketball at the time?
Jim Woldridge was the coach when I first arrived at Kansas State, and those times are what you kind of described. I think if you really fairly look at K-State basketball, if you look at it from I'll say the early to middle 40s through the late 80s, early 90s, K-State basketball was awesome. And then they went through a long stretch there, and it kind of coincided with the rise of football, but it wasn't very good there for 20-some years.
Tex Winter had been the coach.
Yes.
Did you ever get to meet Tex?
I did. One of the coolest things that I did is in my time at Kansas State is we did a history of K-State basketball DVD series, and I got to interview Tex Winter in about a 45-minute setting, probably similar to this. Yeah. And everyone should have that opportunity to talk just the game of basketball and K-State basketball with a guy like that. You know, before him was Jack Gardner, and then following him, Cotton Fitzsimmons and Jack Hartman. And Lon Kruger and Cotton Fitzsimmons. I mean, there's so many guys, you know, that I think K-State is known for coaching. So anyway, back to the original point. It wasn't real good when I first got to K-State, but then Tim Weiser, who hired me, hired Bob Huggins, and in 1 year, I think he kind of turned us around and got us headed in the right direction. And K-State basketball has been pretty darn good since then. We had an Elite Eight run, just missed the Final Four with that 2008 team. Yeah. Now Bruce Weber, after Frank Martin, has been to the tournament 3 times in 5 years. Maybe not quite to where KU's at, but it's hard to be where KU's at. They're a top 5 national program, but certainly it's on the rise and has been rising for a while.
Oh, it's tremendous, and the crowds. The crowds, of course, are building back up under Bruce, and they're building back up, and of course that's somebody's concerned, the athletic director or somebody's concerned if there's empty seats. Why? And what do we need to do to fix it?
Well, we've been really fortunate in my time at Kansas State. I mean, to give you an example, back to football for a moment, we go into this new season 33 straight sellouts. And
amazing.
I can tell you
it's
this.
like Nebraska.
Yeah, when we put a representative basketball team on the floor, we will draw, especially in conference season. And I'm excited about that. I guess the point is this: we have a terrific fan base. And I say all of the time, virtually every day of my life, one of the things that I appreciate most about Kansas State and K-State athletics is our fan base. Because you know this as well as anyone, the people in Northwest Kansas are probably a little different than the people in Southeast Kansas. And the people in Scott County are a little different than those in Johnson County. But the one thing that they all have in common is they love Kansas State and they love the Wildcats, and they come and support us, and I really appreciate that.
Oh, and you're right. You know, I can remember back days ago, and it doesn't matter who the coach was. I could name him, but it doesn't matter. But the other teams, Oklahoma and Nebraska and stuff, they would travel because there was always plenty of seating available at K-State, and the game was over. I can remember Oklahoma having the shoulder pads off by halftime with their starters, and you know, it was embarrassing. But now, in the football program and the basketball program, just the field house doesn't hold as many as the football program. But when I come over here on Saturdays and it's a home football game, I'll take 040 because Interstate's just too busy.
Yeah. Well, I've told this story a million times. I guess I'll tell it here. In my first year at K-State, I was asked to come to Norton to speak to an athletic banquet situation thing. And I met a guy there who was a doctor who was getting ready to retire. And he said at that point that he had season tickets for K-State football and basketball since 1968 and had missed 4 games in that time frame from 68 to 2002, 2 weddings, 2 funerals. That has always resonated with me because it tells you what K-Staters are all about. I can tell you friends that I've met over the course of time that drive from Pittsburgh, Kansas to the games every Saturday, or from Colby or Goodland. And you know what? You got to be pretty committed to do that. And you got to be, we don't have as many that do it in the middle of the week for basketball, but some of them do. They just don't do it every single weeknight. But Saturdays, they're there. And yeah. I appreciate that about them.
I've heard Coach Snyder say how much a home football game makes for the local economy, like $1 million or something. And it's a tremendous figure. You know, you mentioned something, I think it was in the first segment, I kind of wanted to go back to. We were talking about the Oklahoma game. And us who are in the bleachers, and we can see you guys up in the tower area, what happens when the other teams broadcasting groups right there with you and you're just kicking them all over the place, or vice versa? Is there good camaraderie between you folks, or is it, you know, we'll get you?
Well, that's a good question, I think, and a lot of people don't ever think about that part of it. But as we sit here and do this show, I just most recently was in Dallas at Big 12 Media Days and had the opportunity to go out to dinner Monday night, as an example, with the 2 broadcasters for KU and the 2 broadcasters for TCU. We're all friends. We work together. Yeah, you want to win and you want to beat them, and you even joke about that a little bit to a certain degree, but they're all like us. They're there to do a job and they love their school, and What's wrong with that? That's the way it should be.
Yeah, that's the way that it should be. You know, one of the things I've really, everything about the game that you do, Wyatt, I appreciate because you're well informed. And I know how much work that takes to be prepared, to know who the players are on the other, so that you're not waiting for Trent Sanchez or somebody to give you who that person is. And it just makes the flow go better. But it just doesn't happen. You've got to spend a lot of time studying, watching their games, figuring out what they're doing. Well, you're like an assistant coach to it, really.
Well, you mentioned Trent. He is one cog, and an important one, in our crew on game day.
Sure, he's a great guy.
We have a play-by-play guy. We have a color guy, but we also have a Trent Sanchez, who is our runner and our spotter and our statistician, and we've got, you know, lots and lots and lots of people helping us. So it is a collaborative effort. You're right. Stan and I are very fortunate with the crew we have, and we know it. Trent, a big part of that.
Trent does the home games for the Abilene Cowboys and sports games. Just does a great job. Really a nice young man, and I'm glad that he's involved with the program. And I can tell you who he really would like to be like, and that's like you. Well, he appreciates the way you do the games and the preparation. I know that about him.
Well, I hope he gets the opportunity someday, because he's good at what he does, as you described. He has it in his blood, kind of like the rest of us, and those kind of guys are the ones that survive and make it.
Yeah, they do. We got to cut away, take a break. You're watching Stories That Matter. Welcome back to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Wyatt Thompson. And Wyatt, of course, is the voice of the Wildcats, but he grew up in our area in Abilene, and so he's familiar to many of you who are watching this show across the Eagle system. Wyatt, I guess here's the first question that comes back. I want to jump back to the football program for a minute, because this one comes up a lot. Coach Snyder, 77. Mm-hmm. How much longer does he go? And then the second part of that question is Sean being groomed to be able to replace him, and is that likely? Now, that's a tough question for you.
They're good questions, and honestly, I don't really know. I'm around the program every day, but I say I don't know, and here's why I say that. I don't think Coach Snyder knows. You know, he's battled cancer in the off season. He's doing better. He's working at it. I think if he's healthy, he's going to go a while. What does that mean? A year, 2, 3? I don't know. Can Sean be the guy following that? Of course he can. Will he be? That's not my call. That's above my pay grade, as I like to say.
I understand. I understand.
Yeah.
It's been a great program to watch, and I remember when Coach Snyder started, because when he was coming in, I think the Sports Illustrated had Futility U on their front cover, which was Kansas State University, meaning you go there, you're going to die because that program's going nowhere. Well, they missed the boat because Coach Snyder's turned it around, Hall of Fame coach, and I'm so glad that you're there to watch that and to share that with us. I've got total confidence in you. When you're broadcasting it, you keep it nice and level. And some broadcasters favor their own team so much, you say, I'm not even sure that that's an accurate portray of that play. But in this case, I can't tell, because everything is just on the level. It's really well done. Well, Wyatt, thank you for being here.
You're so kind. Thank you so much for having me today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
You've been watching Stories That Matter with Wyatt Thompson.